Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode. We often talk about history repeating itself in security. We saw it with the early web, we saw it again as everything moved to mobile, and we've seen versions of it whenever systems become more automated and more decentralized. Today, the question is, are we about to see it again with AI agents? Our guest today is Jens Ernstberger. Jens comes out of system security and cryptography, the world where you don't just ask, does it work? You ask, what are the guarantees? What are the trust boundaries? And what happens when things compose? He started his journey in academia at the Technical University of Munich, and now he's a co founder of Context.dev, that is context with a K, focused on what it takes to run agents safely, which includes agent identity, a delegated authorization, a least privilege, and the policy plus auditing layer that makes agent access deterministic even when the AI model isn't. Jens, welcome to the show. We are super thrilled to have you here. And if there's anything else that you want to add to the introduction or about your company, please feel free.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Anshuman. Happy to be here. Yeah, I mean, essentially, what we're building at Context Dev is zero trust for agents. So we really try to sit in the toolpath for authorization, evaluate which agent with which user, what task, and what data you're trying to interact with, and then basically issue short-lived scope tokens to delegates your actions to agents safely. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very fascinating space that I'm very keen on sort of understanding how things are working. But before we get to the how the authorization works and all the MCP and OAuth stuff, we actually wanted to start with something else. So in one of the LinkedIn posts of yours, you mentioned that LLMs have a fixed window. Every token costs money and can hurt reasoning, right? So compression is an option, but you so as you mentioned in the post, it loses information, and we are seeing similar problems with coding agents where they automatically start compacting, compressing when they reach the context window length. And if not done correctly, it can result in hallucinations. We all are aware of that, and I think there's also different strategies that companies are adopting to compact and sort of address this problem. So I'm curious to know, how do you think about this space, and what ideas do you think are worth looking into in order to solve this problem? And after you answer this question, I have a follow up, so feel free to continue. But I love to understand your thought process on this difference between MCP and skills. Skills is a new construct that I'm seeing a lot of folks use these days in order to replace MCP, but I'm still not sure if that makes sense. So yeah, love to hear your
Yeah,
thoughts.
absolutely. Happy to get into that a little bit. I'm thinking of it in kind of like I'm thinking of this problem in kind of like a different kind of way. So I think there's two ways to think about it. One is essentially how do you compress, right? Or do you even need to compress, right? And the second one is essentially kind of like how do you even like what even goes into the compression in the first place, right? Like because both are kind of like orthogonal. One like the latter is more towards kind of like security, whereas the first is more towards kind of like performance optimization. So I think like at a very fundamental level, it makes sense to start thinking about it from kind of like the very first kind of like ChatGPT. You kind of like give an input and you get an output, right? Like a lot of people use curse words in their prompts, right? Like which might be or might not be kind of like a good idea in terms of kind of like actually solving your task, because either the curse word is kind of like in the training distribution or it's not, right? Like so, this is kind of like the first kind of like delineation I would make. So in pure kind of like LLM interaction, whether essentially kind of like the thing that you're looking for and how you kind of like phrase it is in the kind of like distribution that you kind of like train on, right? Then towards compaction, right? Like I think what we've seen in the past 2 years roughly is kind of like an evolution from kind of like these chat systems to agents, and then naturally kind of like you have kind of like this iterative reasoning loop with tool calls where you kind of like get more data in, and then like you just dump everything into the context window, and then obviously at some point you need to kind of like compact it, right? Um, uh, the the thing here is, I think as coding agents get trained more and more on actually kind of like producing code. The natural thing that will happen is that kind of like compaction takes kind of like a back step, and you move more and more into actually kind of like file systems and variables, and kind of like moving the compaction itself out of the model. I think a good example of this is code mode, right? Like I think it was introduced by Cloudflare and then also kind of like reiterated on by Anthropic, where essentially the what you can do, instead of kind of like calling three tools sequentially, you write the code to call all of the three, and then kind of like, for example, kind of like summarize the result before giving it back to kind of like the agent in kind of like the context window, right? So essentially that is some kind of like compaction in the first place as well. So, and I think we see more and more that it goes towards this region, right? Like what we're looking into right now also is there's been this paper in the beginning of the year, basically called RLM, from a group I think at Stanford, that essentially is trying to apply the same paradigm that you had with code modes and with tool calling, essentially to reasoning, right? So as an agent contains a kind of like consists essentially of kind of like reasoning and tool calls, applying both code generation, code execution for kind of like scaling out memory for context compaction, and for tool calls for context compaction. My opinion makes a lot of sense, and I think that's also the direction that we'll move into. Now, to the second part of this, essentially, if you think about, okay, like what do you compact in the first place? This is to me really kind of like an access control problem, right? So if you think about, okay, now you have kind of like code modes, you have kind of like these three tools that you want to call via kind of like essentially code that the agent generated, or APIs that you want to call. The question is kind of like, are you allowed in the first place to call that API? All right, and that is kind of like a separate question to be discussed. But the outcome is the same, right? Like whether you're kind of like authorized or not, didn't like basically leads to kind of like a bunch of tokens coming back or not, right? Like, and same for kind of like the code execution and context compaction with code generation, essentially, right? So yeah, and I think like this will evolve towards kind of like authorization becoming more of an optimization problem rather than a pure kind of like security function, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, I think to follow up with that, I think access control definitely is a problem here, right? Because I'm thinking of a scenario, right, where you have this thread with an agent, right, where you're just kind of
Mm.
having conversations, right? And this thread is a long living thread, which means that compaction has to happen in order for the agent to keep remembering whatever you've discussed. Now, while you're having this conversation with the agent, right? If there are certain sort of services that you access via MCP, or there's certain things that you need certain access control implemented on, right? What happens to to that information getting compacted, right? Like, how does access
Mm.
control work well, or like how does access control work in the first place when you're essentially compacting a bunch of data, right? Without really paying attention to, okay, are there fine grained controls that need to be paid attention to or not? Have you seen any sort of approaches or strategies to address this problem?
So far, not
I don't know
really, to be
if my
honest.
question made sense, but
I think it does. So far, not too much. I've seen those primarily be kind of like
yeah,
discussed in isolation. Yeah, the only thing like, I think the main problem here is also like deduction, like deductive reasoning, right? Like if you say like you call tool A, then you call tool B, that might lead to information C, right? Like that you wouldn't have known otherwise, right? Like I think this is also something that nobody really discussed, which might go kind of like into the direction of the question, right? Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Sorry,
But
sorry,
also when you do
Sandesh.
compaction, my sense is, Anshuman, oh no, that's fine. So Anshuman, I think when you do compaction, essentially you're compacting the context. So the next query that you send to your agent just uses what's compacted as its context, right? So there's definitely
yeah,
chances of hallucination, like you rightly mentioned. But from
yeah,
an authorization perspective, unless it also kind of cascades, or it also cascades or
yeah,
compacts what permissions you're given, which kind of, I mean, I can't kind of imagine
yeah,
exactly how that happens in kind of like a like a simple Claude Codes type scenario. But yeah, I guess within, if you actually have an
yeah,
agentic workflow with like multiple steps, then does it have to remember your authorization? And if it has to remember three different things and then it hallucinates what happens, right? My sense is in the end it comes down to like hallucination
Yeah.
and not so much on authorization itself. But could it also hallucinate on authorization is probably a question. But it kind of seems like a pretty
Yeah.
pretty niche
And,
thing. Yeah.
yeah, and I find similar problems exist in the retrieval augmented generation space, right? Where if you're essentially creating a RAG database of a bunch of information, and let's say you have a bunch of sensitive files, and you also have a bunch of non-sensitive files, and if you're creating a vector database of all of that context or content, how are you allowing the user to get data from a document that they're supposed to have access to? So I think in the RAG world, it's kind of like people have already kind of solved it by associating metadata with the data itself, and that
Correct.
metadata gets used to make those decisions. But I think with the compaction and the compression story, I'm not quite sure how that works, right? Like, how does Cloud Code know if this conversation needs to be compacted the way it is, or if it needs to consider the access control and whatnot? I don't know. It's a pretty fascinating space. So yeah, I don't anticipate answers at this point, but just wanted to have those conversations going. Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, like the question is whether compaction, like the question is how do you define compaction, right? Like I think people devised like a lot of methods for kind of like just essentially compacting a text file and kind of like extracting information. Kind of like if you think about it from the perspective of okay, like what's the next query going to be, right? Like theoretically, if you don't know that, you can't really compact in the best way for the next query to be answered, right? Like because you might compact the wrong information, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've also seen or heard some strategies where uh, like folks are maintaining multiple layers of how they're doing compaction. So if for some reason, if the compaction doesn't have the context you need, there is a way to go back to the original data which was compacted in the first place to get those pieces of information. So yeah, I think yeah, this folks are still figuring out. But the other question I had was, so I'm sure you've heard of skills, right? How are you thinking about when to use MCP versus when to use skills? Because I feel like with MCP, right, like you have like an MCP client which runs on the MCP host that can communicate with the MCP server, and then the MCP server advertises certain tools and whatnot. I think this whole architecture is prone to security vulnerabilities, and we've seen that, right? Because you're essentially communicating with the server or HTTPS or HTTP, whatever it is. But with skills, I think that paradigm slightly changes right now, because with skills, you're essentially leveraging the capabilities of a coding agent to be able to execute code on the fly. So you don't really need the MCP related functionality. I'm kind of curious, like, have you explored this, differences? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, to me, those are very complementary, right? Like, I know there's a bunch of people that are also like, there's a couple of libraries where you can basically execute MCP as like TypeScript code and like and so on and so forth, right? To me, skills are really kind of like
Yeah.
mostly kind
Yeah.
of like a very very reproducible and kind of like shareable like basically markdown text file prompt, right? Like that instructs for kind of like a very verticalized workflow.
Yeah. Yeah.
Whereas MCP really solves kind of like the plumbing for it, right? So so to me, like I'm thinking about it as skills are kind of like very vertical, whereas MCP is kind of like very horizontal, right? And I think that mental
Interesting.
model kind of like helps to think about it, and the set of problems that skills versus MCP solve are very orthogonal. I think so. I think we might see a very overlapping kind of
Yeah.
like set of uses in the future. Yeah.
Yeah, I think what the reason maybe there's a little bit of confusion between skills and MCP essentially is that if you wanted to kind of for example, teach Claude something, right? Since you didn't have the skills construct, you had to do it very manually. Now, there
Yeah.
was a simpler way of saying, hey, I figured out how to do it. Now, let me serve that to you through an MCP server, right? So now the simplest way to kind of share my knowledge or my context was you to make call to my MCP server, and I could give that. But now we can just share the skills.md file. So which means that you don't need that additional overhead of using
Yeah.
MCP for just sharing context. But my sense is that all skills can do is provide additional context to Claude. So if your MCP server is doing more than just providing context, then it can't be replaced by a skill. But if all it is doing is giving context, like for example, if I say, hey, write questions in the form of the Boring AppSec podcast hosts, that skill is a perfect use case for it because it's just instructions. But if it's instructions plus actions, which rely on something else, then an MCP, and if it's external, then an MCP server is probably the only vehicle you can use it for. That's kind of how I kind of differentiate skills versus MCP servers in my head. Although he's right that it's perpendicular and not like parallel.
Even for
the only thing to add there is
sorry.
No, I was just going to say the only thing to add there is like with skills, even though they are markdown files, like they're instructions in a markdown file, you can provide certain scripts as an example script, which the coding agent can use to like create code and execute code as well. So it's more than just providing instructions or context.
Sure.
Yeah.
It might be the case.
I think
though,
you were saying something, Jens.
Yeah, exactly. Like I think it might be the case though that like even if like let's take the base case, right? Like if you say like summarize the podcast, right? Like you have let's say you have two different skills might use the same MCP server and lead to totally different outcomes, right? Like for example, summarize this podcast versus kind of like extract the top 3 relevant points or something, right? Like might be kind of like very different kind of like prompts that you give the LLM versus kind of like the MCP server still does only one thing, which is kind of like delivering the podcast script or something, right?
Yeah.
And same goes for coding, right?
Yeah, that's right. And just kind of the whole how did skills come about is also very interesting because I think it was Anthropic who first came out with skills, and then after that every other company has adopted it, and now I think it has become a standard. So every coding agent, every company is adopting the same like the skills construct. So and I think Anthropic then upgraded their slash command or something to skills. So now they are saying use skills. So yeah, the space is so fluid that every day it changes. It is skills today, it might be something else tomorrow. And I think the other thing that is coming out of it is people are contributing skills without looking at the code, and skills are so powerful that you can actually execute code, right? So now I think Cisco recently released a skills a scanner that you can use to scan your skills to find if there's anything malicious going on or not. Right? So yeah, anyways, I think we've spoken about MCP and skills quite a bit, so I definitely want to move from here. And I don't talk to I don't talk about MCP with you, Jens, just because you've written a blog. I believe, I think you called it "The API Keys Are Dead." I think it's on your website, and you laid out a pretty comprehensive blueprint, right, of how we should think about agent identity in the age of MCP using OAuth, right? But right now, if you think about AI coding agents, how they use MCP, such as a browser used to browse the web, there is no OAuth implementation as such, as far as I know, right? Like it largely relies on an API key that might be stored in an environment file, and then the coding agent is supposed to use that key in order to do whatever it wants to do, right? So the agent is inherently inheriting the session cookies from different websites. There's also this concept of a browser relay, which I came across recently, where you're giving the agent complete unfettered access to your browser where you're authenticated to your session, right? Help us understand or help us break this down of how identity plays a role here, and what are some good security practices that we should be thinking about.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, like, this is a super interesting space because, like, we've been experimenting with some of this browser stuff as well. There's a couple of ways to think about it, right? Like, first one is like, what's going to happen in the long run, and I always like to think from first principles, right? So, ideally, probably what's going to happen at some point is if you have like the same service, you have kind of like I like to think about it as kind of like two doors, right? Like you have the agent door and you have the human door, and you might authenticate and authorize kind of like separately, right? What you want to prevent is that the agent uses the human door. The human using the agent door probably won't happen, but that you probably also want to prevent. But I find it kind of like useful to think about it in this way, right? So obviously you can say like, for now, basically the straightforward thing is like, the agent uses my browser and has access to all the services that I have access to, because they kind of like lag behind in technology that allows for the agent to access them from first principles, right? Obviously, the browser itself is not the most efficient interface for agents to interact with the whole web, right? So I think, like, first of all, in the long run, I think like we'll find something different, whether it's going to be MCP or something else. We'll see, right? But just by the pure metric of performance, I think at some point we'll converge to something that is like not an agent using a browser. Secondly, so basically, if you want an agent to be useful, though, for a lot of things, I think like right now you have to do it, right? Like to a certain extent, and then you're absolutely right? Like you inherit the cookies and like whatever from like the user that actually uses it. We actually did experiment with something which is like, because I come from the background of kind of like secure computing, and I did a bunch of work in zero knowledge proofs, right? Like with cryptographic verifiability. What we did is also we basically used a secure enclave, right? Like a trusted execution environment. We emulated a browser in it, and then you let the agent steer the browser, right? So what that gives you is basically encryption at runtime, right? Which is very interesting, because like then you can give it the credentials securely without like anybody being able to decrypt the credentials, essentially, even though they're used at runtime, right? So I'm curious whether we'll see something like that in the future. There's a lot of performance issues with kind of like doing that in practice. I know there's a bunch of services that try to do something like this right now. Basically, kind of like I think there's even like BrowserBase does allow for credentials to be used in a browser. Obviously, there's a ton of risk coming with that, right? Like I think we tried for like 20 years to prevent essentially things like RCE and basically cross-site scripting and SQL injection and so on. Now, essentially using a coding agent that can kind of like interact as the human, right? Like kind of like defeats the threat model of the browser in the first place. So it's a very, very tricky game to play. But yeah. How do you secure it? I think it's a very difficult question because it fully defeats the security assumption we've taken for like 20 years, I guess.
Yeah. No, I mean, or you could use this Claude bot and make RC a feature, right? Anyway, but I kind of wanted to say something interesting, right? I think you brought up a couple of interesting points. One, you're absolutely right. I don't think browsers are necessary for agents. It's probably a nice middle step. Eventually, it should be able to access end sources without having to go to browsers, right? Once kind of the world is ready for AI agents to communicate. The other aspect, which I kind of read in your blog as well, and even while you were explaining, interestingly, if one of the problems with any kind of authentication systems is that for humans is that it has to be simple enough for humans to understand and experience with, right? So building a good user experience for humans is really important. For the longest time, 2FAs didn't work well because it was just so hard. The OTP, the whole flow was crazy, and then with biometrics, it kind of become a little bit simpler, right? So getting UX simple was very, very important. And if you have to make a choice between UX and security, you always chose UX. That was unfortunately kind of how we evolved over time, right? But with agents, I kind of feel like that may not be an issue, because you can essentially say, hey, even if this is a complicated authentication system, authorization system, but like when you recommend that every time you need to, you can do fine-grained access control for every call or every other call, and it still doesn't affect the human. It may lead to some performance issues, but there's at least no user experience issues, right? So I kind of feel like we have an opportunity to kind of like almost keep user experience on the side and just focus purely on what works for security and what works from a feature perspective. And if it does, you can just push it, which I feel like was not an option for many, many years whenever we did security for humans. So that's probably the only thing that makes me a little optimistic about authorization issues with agents, because every other scenario is pretty pessimistic, right? Because it's so hard to kind of do the, the API key examples you gave in the blog are absolutely clear. And there's just no, like you said, there's no real easy way out at this point.
Yeah, absolutely, right. Like I think it's going to be highly use case dependent, to be honest, in terms of kind of like, like whether you act as the user, act for the user, or kind of like act essentially with the user, kind of like being in the loop, right? So I think there's going to be kind of like a very hard distinguishment between kind of like agents that run fully asynchronously. Like, for example, today you can already see like PR reviews, for example, right? Like PR reviews are essentially kind of like autonomous coding bots running in the background, checking your code, right? Like without any human involvement at all, right? Other than
Mm.
the fact that you kind of like authorize them to read your code in the first place and read kind of like every code snippet that you push to the certain branch or something, or then there's kind of like a whole different class of agents where you have like a lot of human involvement, right? Like let's say you want to do insurance payouts, right? Like there might be kind of like a lot of cases where you're above a certain threshold where you kind of like need to consult a human in order to do that, right? Like and I think like the user experience part is obviously like way more important for the latter, because what you want to prevent is kind of like running into the problem of consent fatigue, right? Like probably everybody already knows this, right? Like it's like you click through a lot of authorization screens in like one day, right? And nobody really cares what they say. So I think like this is kind of like where a lot of innovation can happen. I think nobody really has figured it out so far, and that's kind of like the exciting part, right? Like exactly this trade-off between security and usability, right? Like in user experience, both for human involved or kind of like asynchronous agent. And interestingly, like there's because like my background, I did a bunch of work in the decentralized systems space, right? Like for blockchains, for example, you have exactly the same problem, right? Like for example, like you have a secret key, right? Like your wallet essentially like is bound to a secret key. Like when Bitcoin came out, you basically just wrote it on a paper, and then you kind of like put it in the back of your closet and kind of like never found it again until like 20 years later. Nowadays, that's very different, right? Like there's managed services that do very sophisticated cryptographic operations for you not to remember your key at all, and kind of like going more towards kind of like the reconstruction side, right? So, and I expect something like this to proliferate in the domain of agents as well, because I think we're kind of like facing fairly similar issues in terms of maintaining secrets. Yeah.
Yeah, speaking about human in the loop, right, and this consent fatigue problem. One thing very interesting is, we've all heard about Claude Pod by now, right? It was built by this guy called Peter Steinberger out of Austria, Vienna, and I think he's been coming on podcast now. And I was just listening to a podcast with it's a pragmatic engineer thing, right? And he basically mentioned that he ships code and he does not read the code, right? And I think that's where we are heading towards is this. It's just not possible for human beings to review each and every line of code. I think what he mentioned that struck a chord with me was, he focuses more on the architecture, right? Like he understands how things are supposed to work and how things move. And, he focuses on whether the architecture breaks or not, and and he's just kind of focusing on the uh, unit test, integration test. All of those things are going to be more important now, right? So yes, I absolutely agree with the fact that I think human in the loop is maybe necessary for mission critical systems, right, where you absolutely need a human. But I think for the most part, software engineering as a profession, I don't anticipate human in the loop continuing to be a thing with agents. It is scary,
Yeah.
but I think that's
Yeah.
where we're heading towards.
No, but I think you're bang on. I think you kind of said this in a different episode as well, and I've been thinking about it, right? But I think one of the things I kind of like what Claude Code did, which makes a lot of sense, is the whole plan mode stuff. So the way I think about it when I'm writing code, which I don't know a whole lot of, to be honest, but or even my team does when I spoke to them as well, is that you spend a lot more time planning, and in the planning is where you have the human in the loop, right? So you take a lot of time doing the plan mode, but if the idea is with the models being as good as they are today, if your plan's right, you can, and if you have decent test cases, you can nearly assume that the code generation is going to be fine. Right?
Fine.
I kind of, because you're right. If you start saying, hey, I'm going to check each line of code, then your throughput is going to be limited by how much code you can read,
Humans,
as opposed to how much code you can
will be
write.
the
Right? But but the plan can still be reviewed because it's your vision of what needs to be implemented. So I kind of feel like we almost need to go one step. I hate using the word like left, to say, hey, we spend all our effort in the planning phase, and then we spend all that effort in the test cases place. But in the generation, there's no human in the loop. That's kind of that it feels like that's where it's going. It really sounds wrong, but I can't find a logical flaw in the argument.
Yeah, and I think this code generation phase is where companies like Context and Gens will really play a big role of how do agents authenticate, authorize during this process of code generation, because they will have to talk to systems at some point to bring in the context, right? So Yeah, I'm just kind of curious to know, gents, like how do you envision this space evolving where humans will not be reviewing code anymore, but agents, but there has to be some guardrails around agents. Like how do you think about it?
Yeah, definitely. I totally agree that at some point you probably like a significant population of kind of like the current coders won't be coding anymore. At the same time, I think like everybody will become a coder to a certain extent. I like to think of it as kind of like the essentially kind of like the coding agent mullet, right? Like so you basically have like fancy UI in the front and then kind of like coding agent in the back. And like even though you kind of like you're effectively coding, you don't even know that you're doing it, right? Like there's a couple of interesting case studies from credit card companies that already use agents, where a lot of people probably don't even know that like agents are running in the background, right? Like so, probably the same thing is going to happen for coding agents as well, and kind of like code itself will just become another layer of the abstraction, right? Yeah. So yeah,
Yeah. uh, Switching gears slightly, since I know you mentioned you have a background in cryptography and with bitcoins and stuff, so I would love to see you draw parallels between, so in 2023 there was a paper on DeFi attacks where you identified composability as the root, as the root of most evil, right? Contracts interacting in ways developers did not anticipate. Help us draw parallels between that side of the world, right, and with
yeah.
MCP, because MCP is also kind of a plumbing architecture in a way, right? So what have you seen with the DeFi attacks that you're now seeing with MCP, and where do you think we're going towards?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a couple of interesting parallels, but also differences, right? Like at the end, like we're talking about agents and smart contracts. To a certain extent, both are autonomous software, right? Smart contracts are deterministic, agents are non-deterministic, right? Both are to a certain extent stateful, if you want to make them stateful. In the case of agents, I think we're just like cutting that corner right now. Um, in the case of smart contracts, that's essentially by design. Composability is definitely a big issue, right? Like, and the interesting part is like it was even a big issue essentially in smart contracts, where essentially everything is deterministic, right? Like if you give the input, like basically you get the same output the next time. If you have an exploit, that exploit is exploitable until you patch it, right? Um, So it's kind of like better in that case. It's kind of like a little bit worse in terms of kind of like permissionlessness, right? Because essentially you have a system that everybody can access, right? Like it's a globally replicated computer, right? Like that basically maintains a verifiable state machine, right? Which is very interesting because like as soon as you essentially have a bug, right? Like it's exploitable by anybody in the world, right? Like that's not really the case for every kind of agent, but it's the case for basically every smart contract. So it's kind of like the interesting part is like the composability issue gets a lot worse when you factor in non-determinism. An interesting parallel is like also in smart contracts you have something called oracles, right? Like basically pricing oracles. So where you basically where your logic in the smart contract in the code is basically dependent on like an external price, right? Like let's say for example you have like synthetic assets that you want to replicate in a smart contract. You need to kind of like check like what's the stock price of Apple right now, right? And there's like very sophisticated architectures to basically make sure that these oracles are correct, because if you're able to influence them and kind of like make them incorrect, you can manipulate the logic of the smart contract and hence kind of like trigger an exploit, right? Like this is like one of the biggest threats, essentially, kind of like in smart contract land, and that's essentially where you introduce kind of like non-determinism from kind of like external systems. So now the problem is with agents, we have that by design, right? So, it's which makes it way worse, right? Like because now, like if you have like three agents running, like essentially kind of like I don't know, like you have three sub agents or something, right? Like it's basically you have like basically the problem squared, right? So it's very difficult, like how this will play out. I assume what we're going to try to do as kind of like an industry is find deterministic factors that we can introduce, like both on the model side as well as on the systems they touch side, right? Like in order to flag things that might not be intended, right? However that might look like. But like to a certain extent, you need determinism. Otherwise, like you're just letting things loose. I think that's kind of like the biggest analogy I can draw in that part.
Interesting. Have you seen any interesting agentic use cases, workflows in the decentralized world with bitcoins and stuff?
I mean, in general, I think like the most exciting thing is stablecoins, right? Like,
Stable.
it's the what's happening right now is like agents are great because like you can essentially give them give them a wallet and make them do micropayments, right? Like it never worked for humans because like for humans like you can't really do micropayments because it's like due to the UX, right? Like for agents that's a lot better because they don't care. And I think where we'll see that first is on the side of publishers, right? Like I think publishers are struggling because everybody gets their information through like ChatGPT or Perplexity or whatever, right? Like, and not like I suppose there's a lot less traffic on the New York Times, right? Like, so the thing will really be like, how does the New York Times get incentivized for the journalism that they do, whereas kind of like the information that they put online is immediately extracted by bots, right? Like, and I think this is kind of like where things like payments through stablecoins via blockchains can become really interesting, right? I think there's a couple of standards in that direction, like for example X42. I'm not sure if you heard about that. It's kind of like been a big thing at some point last year, and that overlap is really really interesting and really exciting, right? Like basically moving money through border, like without borders, right? Like across kind of like a globally replicated system and using it to kind of like do micropayments for digital services, right? Like so that's really interesting. Other than that, yeah, that's kind of like the thing I'm most excited about. But like yeah, not really focused on right now.
That's good. Hey,
Yeah,
sorry,
go
finish
ahead.
your thought, Anshuman. I was
Uh,
switching gears, so go ahead, finish your thought.
Yeah. No, I think this whole landscape of content scraping has become very controversial. I feel where ChatGPT and uh, Perplexity, all of these services, so like you mentioned, they can scrape web content really easy. And like what happens to a New York Times, Wall Street Journal, I don't know. And what happens to the people who put this content out there. And this is something that uh, both like Sandesh and I, we have our own blogs and stuff. And I ask that question to myself sometimes as well: is does it make sense for me to put my blogs on my own website where I am in control, ownership, right? Or does it make sense for me to put my content on like things like LinkedIn, uh, Substack, right, where I'm not necessarily in control of it, but it gives me that distribution which I need, right? And I don't know a good answer there. The only answer is I put my content everywhere, right? So wherever people can find it's good. But yeah, no, I think this whole where it's kind of becoming easy to scrape content on the web, right? And like, why would people go to Wall Street Journal if they can have that information plus a lot more in
Yeah.
ChatGPT, right? Yeah,
Yeah. So there are 2 points. This is a topic of great interest for me as well. So
yeah.
there are a couple of points here, right? So one is, by the way, if you go paste a Substack link on ChatGPT now or on Claude, it cannot read it anymore. Right. So if you paste our Substack link, it actually cannot summarize it because Substack blocks traffic from the main model providers. I'm sure there are ways around it, but in general, if they realize it's a AI agent traffic, they actually kind of block it and they don't let them scrape it, right? I'm sure it's going to be a chicken and egg game, and we'll see who comes out on top. But the
Use a
second thing
browser.
is this. Exactly, right. Use a browser. That's exactly what they do now. So you can just do browser use and then wait 40 seconds for it to read an article you could have read in 20 seconds. But hopefully that'll improve over time as well. But the second part to your question, to your point, Anshuman, is that there's an economist named Tyler Cowen who runs a fantastic podcast called Conversations with Tyler, and he wrote something very interesting. He said the point of writing in the future should be to teach LLMs about your opinion and screw the humans. Right. So the idea is not so much, if Anshuman has a blog, should you be writing for Jens and Sandesh? Well, not really. You should be writing for ChatGPT, because long after you're gone, if somebody wants to understand what Anshuman's opinion is something, they're not going to come to your website. They're going to come to ChatGPT anyway, right? So the idea is that you should write in such a way that it's easier for the LLMs to understand what you say, and if the humans understand it as well, that's a bonus, right? Now, I'm not sure I subscribe to it, but that kind of opens up the questions on LLMs.txt and things like that, right? Saying, hey, if you really want distribution, then go all out and make it easy for the bots to learn. Like, if you can't beat the bots, then, I don't know, co-opt them, I guess, like make it easier. Or
Yeah.
go all the way other round and say, hey, put a paywall behind it and say, unless a human pays for it, I'm not going to let you read it.
Yeah, I think I tend to disagree to a certain extent with that notion of kind of like writing. I think like we already see this happening in the domain of generative engine optimization, right? Like the SEO of the future, where a lot of companies put like a lot of blogs on their website that are not listed, that are optimized for essentially for LLMs to read and scrape, such that they turn up like on top of basically whatever they suggest, right? So I think we already see this, and like if you read those blogs as a human, it's like it's terrible.
It's horrible. Yeah.
And probably nobody does it, but like it kind of like serves its purpose. On the thing of writing, like if I write, like what I like to do is mainly write for myself, because like I think writing is thinking, and like I think if we lose that, we lose the last bit of thinking that we have left. So like it's a difficult question. Maybe you like it will definitely kind of like separate into kind of like two classes of content, right? Like which we already see. One is kind of like more driven by authenticity, right? Like which also kind of like helps yourself in digesting content and thinking about things. And the other one is purely towards kind of like business outcome, essentially, right? And I think that's definitely happening.
The
I
business outcome
actually
part is
posted
interesting.
about this recently.
No, finish your thoughts.
No, I'm just saying I actually posted about this recently on LinkedIn, where I had the same thought, right? Where, look, if I do write because it helps me in thinking and getting my concepts cleared, and I think that is really beneficial, and I don't want to let go of it. But there's also this other piece of content where I'm, let's say, doing a research on how browser relay works, right? And I want to write a blog about it, but it's not really using a lot of my brain power or my sort of creativity, so to speak. So if I can use AI to create that blog where it kind of makes the whole explanation easier and kind of structures it in a way that is easy to understand, then why wouldn't I use AI, right? So yeah, I think people who write content, I think they are kind of debating this whole shift, right, of whether they should use AI or not, and if they are using AI to write the content or during the process of the content creation itself. That itself is pretty interesting. But I just want to share that. Go ahead, Sandesh.
Last point before I switch gears, right? I kind of, the mental model I have in my head is that for code versus content, I kind of feel like you should use AI to generate code always, and then review it manually, or plan manually and then have the AI write the code. But for content, it's kind of the opposite. You always write it yourself and you have the AI kind of comment on it or critique on it. That's kind of what has worked best for me. And I've also realized that I every time I write a blog, I usually write it myself, and then I kind of go paragraph by paragraph, or like sentence by sentence sometimes, depending on what I'm writing, and then ask the AI to critique, because I kind of feel like for whatever reason on the written word they're better at critiquing than actually generating. Maybe it's just a model thing. The next release of the model, they get better. But I agree with Jens that for me, it's an absolute turn off the moment I feel like an AI wrote it. I don't feel like reading it anymore, even if the content is compelling, right? There's something about authenticity there that you want to read from a human, or at least if you're told to read from a human, right? And that's kind of why I kind of feel like the whole generative AI engine, answer engine optimization stuff is really marketing where at this point. Nobody actually knows how to get on top of ChatGPT results, right? So maybe you have to buy ads. That's the only way to do it. Anyway, I want to switch gears. I know we have only a few more minutes because I wanted to ask one question, which is very interesting, I thought. I don't think we've interviewed a lot of founders who were in academia and then moved into being a founder, especially in security. So, Jens, I'd love to kind of hear what made you decide that and how that journey has been. Because I went from industry to industry, essentially, though building a startup is much different from working in a company. But I can only imagine how different it must have been from going from academia to founders, right? So I'd love to hear a little bit more about, what made you decide and how you went about doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, essentially, I was always following what I found most interesting, right? Like, and a lot of these things, like, it's really interesting how deep you can go. I think what my time in academia has taught me is like how to find the limits of knowledge, right? Like, I always like to think about knowledge as essentially kind of like a sphere, right? Like, and you're trying to kind of like make a bump into it, right? Like, into one direction. The question is kind of like, where's really the end, right? Like, because there's a finite amount of information out there, but like, it seems infinite from kind of like a human perspective, right? So that was kind of like the reason why I think academia was great, and how it also kind of like helped my thinking. And the reason, like, what I was always working on in academia was protocols, systems that are basically real world applicable, right? Like, so I was at implementations with my papers, and like, worked very close to kind of like things that are also implemented in industry, and things that are also basically useful as like a product, right? So essentially, what I decided for myself is that like, the incentive scheme of not working in academia is more interesting than working in academia, because like you have like very long review cycles, right? Like, and it can be tiring at some point. I think research is still super interesting. I think I'm still doing a lot of research, on a kind of like daily basis, and I'm very interested into it. But I would probably only continue research in kind of like a domain where I know, like, look, like this is something like that you cannot do if you go into industry, right? Like, like, I don't know, quantum physics is like one very, very, very interesting domain, like where that is the case, right? Like in the case of security, there's also a lot of things like that go into that direction, right? Like post-quantum cryptography, right? Like a lot of that stuff wouldn't be in existence without academia. Yeah, I think. I mean, it makes a ton of sense. I think like a lot of people ask basically whether the introduction of AI has made it better or worse to be doing a PhD. I think it's made it better, because the significant time you spend like writing, right? Like, I finished my PhD like basically right before kind of like ChatGPT was really kind of like taken off and useful in that domain, right? Like, so all of my work that you see on the academic side is like purely handwritten. Yeah, I think it's probably more exciting than ever, because you can just make so much more progress in so less time, right? Like, so you can really think about the hard problems, right? Like, so, yeah, I'd encourage people, even in the security industry, to kind of like go through it and do it. Yeah, I think it's still super interesting. The transition, I mean, like, it's very different though, right? Like, because you have a very different set of things you kind of like optimize for from an industry perspective versus the academia perspective, right? Like, but industry doesn't always give you kind of like 6 months to kind of like work on a problem and maybe toss it into a bin at the end, right? Like, so that might be problematic.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. I've always thought about what AI means for like engineering colleges, like a CS degree, like a
Yeah.
how much can a college degree teach you that like AI cannot teach you. But I never thought about what it means for doing PhD. Like that is interesting. Maybe you can now finish your research in a couple of years instead of 5 years, depending on what you do,
Yeah.
because a lot of the busy work is now taken away, and then you can just focus on pure research as quickly as possible. Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you
Cool.
can even get to the like a significant amount of time I've spent on thinking about how to get to the point where I'm sure that this is kind of like the state of the art in something, right? Like, and I think like by now essentially that is like one query away, right? So like, that makes it a lot easier.
Yeah. One deep research away, and then you're done.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. All right.
Well,
Cool.
awesome. Yeah, I think, gents, that should be it. Thank you again so much for taking the time and sharing your insights. We really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you. This
Thank
is
you so
great.
much.
Yeah.
Thank you, Anshuman.
Yeah,
Thank you,
and
Sandesh.
yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us. If you like the show, please share this with your friends and colleagues. If you have any questions or comments, you can reach Anshuman on Twitter at Anshuman_BH. That's ANSHUMAN_BH. And me, Sandesh, at Juba on Jeans. That's JUBBAONJEANS. See you next time.